In the winter of 1846–47, 87 men, women, and children found themselves stranded by an early and brutal snowfall in the high Sierra Nevada, forced to confront hunger, isolation, and impossible choices. Good evening. Join me as we follow the slow unraveling of the Donner Party, how a fateful decision, relentless mountain, and the stubborn will to survive combined to create one of the most haunting episodes of America's westward expansion. They began like many others of their era, families and individuals leaving the settled Midwest, hopes folded into canvas wagons, guided by promises of richer land and fresh starts in California. News of fertile valleys and milder climates spread in letters and pamphlets. One man, Lansford Hastings, voiced the boldest hope, a shortcut through the mountains that would shave weeks from the journey. His name would follow the emigrants like a shadow. The party moved west in the spring of 1846, moving through plains and across rivers. At first the land seemed to bend to their will. Oxen plodded, children ran between wagons, laughter still survived. But choices accumulate. When Hastings' shortcut, later known as the Hastings Cutoff, was chosen, the road that promised speed instead demanded time. Difficult terrain and broken wagons slowed the company. Supplies dwindled. Friction appeared among leaders and families. By autumn they had been delayed, and the Sierra, usually a late guard, arrived early and without mercy. In late October and November, towering walls of snow closed the mountain passes. The emigrants reached the shores of a small alpine lake, now called Donner Lake. There they tried to wait the winter out. They built rough shelters, rationed flour and dried meat, and prayed for a thaw. Day by day, the snows deepened. The wagons were abandoned, the oxen could not plow through the drifted plains. Men who had once promised new farms now learned the hard geometry of survival, the width of a snowdrift, the outlines of a buried tree, the risk of cutting a path only to find an impassable slope beyond. Desperation breeds action. Small parties set out on foot to cross the mountains and reach the settlements along the Sacramento Valley. One group, later called the Forlorn Hope, walked for weeks across frozen ranges, losing members to exhaustion and exposure. Others remained at the camps, tending children, nursing the injured, and managing the fragile stores of food. The decisions made in those frozen weeks were not dramatic in the way of battlefields, they were quiet, painful, and mercilessly practical. Who would eat what tonight? Who would take the last of the flour? Who would be sent to fetch more? When options ran out, some survivors resorted to desperate measures, including cannibalism, to remain alive. Such acts are difficult to write of and harder to comprehend, they must be described with dignity and restraint. They are part of the grim ledger of human choices under absolute deprivation. Leadership in the party was fractious. George Donner, the family patriarch, was senior in name, while James Reed, an energetic and outspoken man, often took initiative, until a violent quarrel led to Reed's banishment from the main camp. Reed, once away, crossed the mountains and became one of the key organizers of the rescue attempts from California. The split among leaders and the small decisions, whose counsel to trust, which road to take, when to press onward, mattered more than any single headline moment. In the end, the mountain did not ask permission. It responded to weight, to timing, to the patience of the elements. Beyond the human drama, the geography itself was a relentless antagonist. The Sierra Nevada is a wall of granite and ice that separates the Central Valley from the eastern deserts. Snow can accumulate in long cornices and drifts, burying trails that only weeks earlier had been visible. The emigrants were denied both retreat and free passage forward. They had neither the supplies to endure a long siege nor the clear lines to break and escape. Winter turned the landscape into a sealed room. Rescue came, eventually. Settlers and hunters from California, alerted by men who had made the long journey out, organized parties in the late winter and early spring. They set out with pack mules, provisions, and the grim knowledge that they might be too late. The first relief parties reached the stranded camps in February and March of 1847. Some found families still clinging to hope, others found silence. Across several missions, rescuers brought out survivors in small groups, returning again and again until the mountain yielded what it would. When the snow finally retreated, the tally was sorrowful. Of the original company, only a little over half survived. The names carved into the story, Donner, Reed, Breen, Tamsen Donner among them, became shorthand for a broader narrative about migration and miscalculation. Patrick Breen, one of the emigrants, kept a diary through the winter. His daily entries, simple and direct, give us a chronology measured not in days but in dwindling supplies and the changing condition of neighbors. It is in such small records, lists of rations, notes on the weather, the care given to a child, that the enormity of the ordeal becomes human and immediate. There are lessons here that go beyond tragedy. First, the story reminds us of the fragile relationship between human plans and the natural world. Temporal shortcuts, when taken without full knowledge, can become traps. Second, it asks uncomfortable questions about leadership, communal responsibility, and the limits of charity. Third, and perhaps most important, it is a testament to endurance, to the care shown by those who stayed, the courage of those who walked for help, and the resilience of survivors who, after one of the harshest experiences one community can suffer, went on to rebuild their lives. We must also place this event in its wider context. The mid-19th century was an age of movement, of families leaving the familiar for promises of land, of pamphlets that emboldened travelers to trust quick routes, of settlers encountering landscapes that did not conform to their maps. The Donner Party's fate did not stem from malice but from a combination of misjudgment, individual frailty, and nature's impartial force. It serves as a cautionary tale about the costs of speed when knowledge and preparation are lacking. As the snow settled into a memory, the story continued to be reshaped, in newspapers, in memoirs, in the harsher folklore that followed. Over the decades, narratives simplified into scandal or into heroism, losing the textured reality of people huddled in makeshift cabins, of mothers trying to shelter infants, of men risking life and limb to fetch help. If we listen to the original voices, the diaries, the letters, the sparse accounts of rescuers, we hear less drama and more the quiet persistence that defined the survivors. There is a dignity in that persistence, even amid actions that we find morally wrenching. If you stay with the whole account, you will hear this quiet voice, that history is not only the record of triumph but also the catalogue of choices made in extreme conditions. You will see how a recommendation for a shortcut, a delayed schedule, and an early storm can combine to test the limits of human compassion and endurance. There is value in understanding these moments because they sharpen our sense of how communities fail and how they endure. In the end, the Donner Party is not merely a spectacle of suffering, it is a mirror. It shows how people behave when institutions are thin and resources scarcer, how leadership can both falter and rally, and how the human impulse to help persists through even the bleakest winters. The survivors carried their losses through the rest of their days, the mountain held its winter like a secret. We are left to listen, to learn, and to remember. If you would like more careful historical narratives told in this tone, please consider subscribing. Thank you for listening to this account of a dark winter in the Sierra and the lives it irrevocably altered. Hook and greeting, a wagon train trapped by winter. A wagon train bound for the promised valleys of the West found itself hemmed in by a winter that would not yield. Men and women who had ridden for months beneath a merciless sun now faced a different enemy, deep snow filling the passes, the cattle gone thin, and routes choked with drifts so high that the wheels of their wagons vanished from sight. This was not a single night's misfortune, it was a slow collapse of options that left a community of emigrants with dwindling food, failing shelters, and the vast silence of granite mountains for company. Good evening, and thank you for joining this close account of how a party of pioneers endured an American winter that tested every skill they possessed. They had separated from the main road on a promise of a shortcut, and the choice shaped their fate. The path they took became harder terrain, rougher than maps suggested and longer than guides had claimed. Snow came earlier and deeper than anyone expected. At the highest reaches of the Sierra, where wind scoured the pines and the air cut like a blade, the wagons were parked and the oxen and cattle could not be driven forward. Sledges and rough cabins became the new lodgings, tarps and planks, the new walls. Supplies dwindled with each passing day, and the decisions grew heavier than any pack. Families huddled together, trying to turn the ordinary business of survival into something bearable. Fires were coaxed from damp wood. Wet blankets were wrung and dried by careful hands. Parents wrapped children in whatever clothing remained, trading warmth and comfort for the thin protection of layered wool. Men trekked out in small groups when the weather allowed, trying to reach valleys and settlements that might send relief. Those journeys were measured in the strain of hypothermic fatigue and the slow accounting of what could be carried and what had to be left behind. The mountain did not hurry, it simply persisted. Voices spoke less and listened more. People kept journals and left messages, they kept watch for figures on horizons and for the sound of distant bells. In the meadows by the frozen lakes, shelters were reinforced with whatever timber could be wrested from the snow's cape. Meals were rationed with ceremony, a thin broth, a few roots, sometimes the last of salted meat passed from hand to hand. The daily task of maintaining hope sat beside the practical tasks, mending harnesses, patching wagon beds, measuring the last handfuls of flour. Children learned a new vocabulary of survival, they learned which fractures in the ice could hold a boot and which would not. Hope arrived in fits and starts. Small parties set out to find help, some succeeding and returning with news, some forced to turn back by storms that rose without warning. Those who reached settlements in lower valleys described distances that seemed impossible to the stranded, and then strangers arrived from the towns, men sent to bring food and to guide more organized rescue efforts. Their approach across the wind-scoured ridges looked like a miracle to those who had been watching the tree line for weeks. Yet rescue came at a pace dictated by terrain and weather, not by urgency, and the first notes of relief did not mean that the ordeal was over. There were still makeshift graves to be marked, and there were still tired bodies to be carried. Through it all, decisions made under pressure revealed the character of the group. Leadership emerged in practical forms, people who could fix a frozen axle, women who organized cooking with tiny stores of grain, men who negotiated with approaching crews. Stories of courage and stubborn resourcefulness are many. One example is of those who repurposed the iron from a broken stove into tools for digging out cabin shelters, or of the cautious expeditions that scavenged for edible roots that grew beneath snowmelt. These acts were not grand gestures, they were quiet halts of ingenuity that kept people alive. The emotional landscape was as stark as the physical one. Grief settled in like the evening cold. Families whose plans for new farms and brighter futures were halted by the mountain had to reconcile the promise of tomorrow with the losses of today. Conversations took on the cadence of practical consolation, and prayers and songs threaded through the camps in the long nights. Even in their desperation, people kept a sense of dignity, covering the dead with blankets, recording names carefully on pieces of leather, and reminding one another of the small courtesies that preserve humanity when everything else frays. If you find this account meaningful, please consider subscribing for more carefully told narratives of the American frontier. There is more to the story in the way rescues were attempted, in the difficult choices made, and in the aftermath that reshaped the lives of those who survived. For now, remember the image of wagons half buried in white, of hands tracing the outlines of maps that led nowhere, and of a community that, against the indifferent mountain, kept tending to one another with whatever light they had left. Setting: the westward journey and the fatal choice of route. During the westward migration, a single decision about which road to take could change the fate of an entire company of emigrants. Hello? The Donner Party set out with hopes like many others, fertile fields and a new life beyond the mountains. They followed the well-worn tracks of the California Trail for much of the journey, but a promising alternative route was put before them, one that promised shorter miles and faster passage, and which would come to be known simply as the Hastings Cutoff. Lansford W. Hastings, a man who published a guide to emigrants bound for the West, urged travelers to leave the established trail and strike out across untested country south of the Great Salt Lake. He offered bold assurances: save distance, bypass difficult river crossings, and reach California sooner. Some wagon masters accepted his counsel on faith. Others weighed it against experience. The Donner Party, pressed by delays and eager to reach their destination, chose to follow the new path. That choice demanded an immediate change of rhythm. Where the main trail followed river valleys and a known chain of grass and water, the cutoff led into rougher ground, broken canyon, alkali sinks, and stretches of desert without the reliable forage the oxen required. The consequences came quickly. Going through the Wasatch Range meant working harder to cut road for the wagons. Time was lost where trees had to be felled to create passages, and hours of labor turned to days. In the broad salt desert beyond, oxen and cattle weakened. Wagons bogged in alkali and needed effort to be extricated. Food and fodder diminished, and the party fell behind the timetable needed to safely cross the Sierra. Tension followed these mechanical setbacks. Decisions once made were not easily reversed. There were disputes among leaders, and differences in temperament that might have been manageable on a plane took on sharper significance when every night brought uncertainty. As the company pressed westward again onto more familiar portions of the California Trail, they found themselves carrying the price of those earlier delays. Where seasoned emigrants planned river crossings so as to reach the Sierra before the winter snows, the Donner Party arrived at the foot of the mountains later than was prudent. Weather that could have been seasonal transformed into a trap. In the high country, snows came earlier and thicker than the emigrants had been able to predict, and the passes that merchant wagons and government freighters had used for years became barricaded by drifts of white. The party divided its encampments into two main sites near the mountain lakes and creeks, places that would shelter them but not supply enough to sustain long entrapment. Groups of men set off in search of lower passes and assistance. A small band later known as the Forlorn Hope made a desperate effort to cross snowbound slopes to reach settlements and rescue. Others stayed behind to protect what remained, wagons, scant cattle, and the families clustered together for warmth. The valley of the Truckee, later marked on maps by Donner Lake and Alder Creek, became a graveyard of plans. Simple, practical shortages turned into existential crises, the loss of draft animals, the spoilage of supplies, and the inability to move heavy wagons through deep snow. There were also human consequences, arguments over leadership, the banishment of one man after a violent quarrel, and the burden of making choices under duress. The fatal choice of route did not appear as a single dramatic moment, but as a widening accumulation of small misjudgments and misfortunes. Taking the cutoff had not immediately produced disaster. It was the compounded effect, weeks of delay, exhaustion of animals, depletion of stores, that left the emigrants vulnerable to the mountain weather. Had the party kept the established trail, they might have found the passes open or reached settlements with their livestock intact. Specific, avoidable obstacles, deep sand and tree-choked canyons, slowed them. The hard reality was that the Sierra does not negotiate with intentions, it responds to presence and timing. By the time the first major storms surged down from the high ridges, these travelers had been worn thin by the desert and the detours. There are human faces behind each logistical error. George and Jacob Donner acted as patriarchs to their kin, their authority carrying weight in decisions about camps and travel. James F. Reed, after being expelled from the main group for striking another man during an argument, would later mount efforts to save his family. The story of the route is also the story of those individual actors, each bearing the consequences of a decision none of them had fully understood at the time. The cut made by Hastings had been advertised as a shortcut in a guidebook, and that promise met hard landscape and season. The emigrants learned, painfully, that a guide's optimism cannot substitute for the realities of terrain and weather. Even the geography that once seemed so amenable to travel turned treacherous. Where grass used to line riverbanks, exhausted herds found only scrub. Where the established road ran along the Humboldt River with nights of flat campsites, the new path demanded constant making of way. Wagon tongues were lashed, axles strained, and every mile required more from men and beasts alike. Examples of small, compounding losses are plain: a failed river crossing that cost a wagon wheel, a bogged wheel team that could not be rehitched in time, a cache of provisions spoiled in damp. Each undercut the ability of the entire company to move at the pace winter required. When snow finally held their wagons, it exposed how marginal many of their supplies had become. They made camp beneath towering pines on the shores of a high lake and along a cold, shallow creek, believing shelter would buy them survival through the season. But the decision to enter and follow the Hastings cutoff had already tipped probabilities against them. Rescue parties later found tracks of heads bowed through drifts, of men and women hauling what they could. The landscape was beautiful in its severe way, yet indifferent. It offered no explanation for why a path that promised ease had led so quickly to peril. The fatal choice of route is a cautionary tale about judgment under pressure and the unforeseen costs of innovation. It shows how a single recommendation, advanced with confidence by a guide unfamiliar with every stretch of the road, can alter the timetable upon which lives depend. Practical details, where to ford a river, where to rest animals, how to allocate scant forage, became the arithmetic of survival. Those choices multiplied until there was nothing to multiply. In the end, the geography closed in, and the emigrants learned that the mountain season would not wait for human contrivance. Thank you for listening to this account of how route and circumstance intertwined. If you would like more measured histories told in this tone, please consider subscribing for further stories of people whose decisions met the strongest elements. The storm, isolation, hunger, and desperate decisions, non-graphic. The Donner Party was a group of American immigrants bound for California in 1846 who found themselves trapped by relentless winter storms high in the Sierra Nevada after following an untested shortcut promoted by Lansford Hastings. Hello? Snow closed the passes, wagons became immovable islands of wood and iron, and the landscape around them hardened into a white silence that blocked rescue and erased routes. Cold and wind pressed on the tents and cabins. Isolation became a constant pressure on minds and bodies alike. At first the emigrants worked with the tools they had, axe and saw, teams of oxen, and whatever stores could be preserved. Food dwindled as the days lengthened into weeks. Cattle and horses that had been their power became food and labor, and then simply supplies to conserve. Men chopped and burned wagon boxes for warmth and fuel, conserving every scrap that might be converted to heat. The effort to shelter from the storm produced scenes of stubborn industry and weary resignation in equal measure. Families clustered by the embers. Children, silent and small, waited while adults debated priorities. Rationing was methodical at first. Small portions of flour were mixed with what roots and dried meat remained. Preservation gave way to improvisation. One household converted every bit of leather and bone they could to something edible or useful. Another dug deeper into snow to hollow out windbreaks. The soundscape changed to the whisper of shifting drifts and the muffled crunch of footsteps over packed snow. Conversations became clipped and practical. People wrote down plans and yet the weather rewrote them faster. Decision after decision hardened into necessity. Some wagons were abandoned when the animals could no longer pull them. Others were stripped for wood to reinforce makeshift cabins. Personal possessions were traded and repurposed. The moral calculus of survival tightened, choices that once would have been unthinkable moved into the range of possibility. Respect for the dead and the living guided many acts, while fear and hunger pulled at others. Resentment grew when leadership arguments turned public. The cold sharpened tempers and blurred judgment. At night there were long, tense hours of listening for change, while by day bodies were spent on repetitive tasks meant only to postpone collapse. Small parties made valiant attempts to reach lower ground for help. Snowshoes and improvised sleds were fashioned out of wagon parts and rope. Some parties set out with the hope of summoning assistance, carrying minimal supplies and pulling what they could. Many turned back, routed by the depth of drifts and the exhaustion of their limbs. A few pressed on, guided by compass, fir trees, and sheer resolve. Their stories of navigation by stars blurred by storm and of fighting visibility are preserved in later testimonies and journals. When word finally reached settlements in the valleys, organized relief could begin, but only after the winter had already exacted its toll. Hunger reshaped daily life. The aroma of boiling broth, once taken for granted, became a rare and holy thing. People measured out portions with trembling hands. The sick and the elderly became the most vulnerable, and caring for them demanded resources the living could scarcely afford. When those resources ran out, painful moral reckonings followed. Documents and survivor accounts make clear that decisions were made in a context of sustained deprivation and extreme cold. Those who chose to make lasting sacrifices did so under an unrelenting canopy of storms that denied easy answers. The emotional cost was invisible but pervasive. Sorrow settled like snow on every interaction. Many wrote later of the silence after a neighbor's passing, the absence of familiar footsteps, the emptied corner of a shelter. Grief and guilt rippled through the encampments. Some participants recorded their own amazement at acts they could not have envisioned before the winter, giving the last bread to another, choosing who might take a sled in the next push for help, or deciding when to burn the last of the wagon wood to heat a family through the night. These accounts are sober and often fragmented, but they converge on the same portrait of human beings pushed to the limit. Leadership fractured and reformed under pressure. Where strong direction existed, parties organized snowshoe patrols and ration lists. Where it did not, disorder propagated, and smaller conflicts took on outsized importance. Many survivors recounted debates about the right moment to move, others spoke of quarrels that ended only when exhaustion intervened. These conflicts were not trivial. They were survival mechanisms misapplied or contested. In the frozen glare, every choice seemed both necessary and inadequate. The turn from animal and plant food to what remained after deaths among the group was a painful, solemn subject for all who lived through it. Later statements and contemporary journals treat these episodes with restraint and anguish rather than spectacle. They emphasize the cold arithmetic of survival under extreme conditions, the impossibility of foraging in deep snow, the near absence of game in a landscape buried for months, and the collapse of livestock as fodder and traction. Those who recorded their experiences did so with an attempt to explain necessity rather than to sensationalize suffering. The tone is often confessional, remorseful, and weary. Relief came in stages, and each arrival bore its own scene of shock and careful triage. Early rescuers faced similar hazards, avalanches and blinding squalls, the same treacherous snow that had stalled the emigrants. They moved methodically, hauling people out on sleds, bringing food and clothing, and sometimes making the hard decisions about who could be moved immediately and who would require care first. Survivors remembered the relief parties as both salvation and a reminder of how near they had come to losing everything. The first steps down from the high encampments were tentative and slow, as bodies readjusted to the exertion of travel after long immobility. Memory preserved images of simple acts of kindness that mattered as much as any rescue: a blanket shared against a night wind, a cup of warm broth offered without question, a willing hand to guide someone through a field of hidden drifts. Those small mercies punctuate the record and complicate any single narrative of failure or blame. People who had argued the day before found themselves partners at the fire. Strangers became family by necessity and often remained so in their recollections. Reflection on the winter gives us a portrait of endurance more than of calamity alone. The storm was not merely weather, it was a force that rearranged priorities, remade relationships, and compelled decisions that have troubled readers and historians ever since. Accounts emphasize not only the cruelty of the environment but the resourcefulness and dignity of those who endured it. Many who lived through it would later weigh their choices in private writings, seeking absolution, explanation, or simply a record of why they had done what they did. If this account drew you in and you would like more calm, fact-based narratives of pivotal moments, please consider subscribing for further historical stories told with care and respect. Thank you for listening. Rescue and Aftermath, Survival, Lessons, and Legacy. During the winter of 1846 to 1847, several relief parties fought their way over the Sierra through blizzards and deep drifts to reach those who had been trapped. Hello? The first arrivals found men, women, and children so thin and weak that walking unaided was impossible for many. Some had burned what little wood and fabric remained for heat. Others had kept watch through endless nights and rationed their strength to coax a faint life from meager stores. Among the small groups who left the camps to seek help was the party known to history as the Forlorn Hope, a desperate band that cut a human trail through the snow and forced the wider community to respond. Rescue came in stages rather than as a single triumphant effort. Small organized relief parties, drawn from nearby settlements and trading posts, trudged to the emaciated camps with flour, bacon, and trade goods, returning with the first of the survivors on crude sleds and on foot. Journeys that might normally have taken days required weeks, supply lines were fragile, weather was merciless. Each sortie into the mountains was a negotiation with frost and isolation. Some rescuers carried the dying over ridges and across frozen streams, while others remained to clear burial sites and pack what little they could salvage for families on the trail. The pace was slow. The costs were high. Yet, slowly, the living were led down toward valleys and settlements where doctors attended to frostbite, fever, and malnutrition. The human toll left deep, complex scars. Those who were brought back to settlements faced not only recovery of body but also recovery of reputation. Rumors and sensational accounts traveled ahead of the survivors, magnifying grief into public spectacle. Several survivors later gave careful, harrowing accounts of what they had endured, and their testimonies became primary sources for historians and writers. Communities argued over responsibility, inquiries questioned decisions made months earlier, some families were reunited, while others never found peace. The moral conversations were immediate and persistent, about leadership and judgment, about the limits people face in extremity, about what mercy means when survival is at stake. Even when details were softened in polite conversation, the core facts remained stark and unignorable. Lessons were drawn in practical and institutional ways. The tragedy underscored the danger of untested shortcuts and the necessity of accurate route information for long overland travel. It prompted a harder look at provisioning and timing for migrations across mountain ranges. Over time, the public and private sectors invested more in mountain weather warnings, better trail markers, and more reliable supply depots where possible. In short, planning for contingencies became less optional and more essential. The episode also shaped how rescuers and bystanders thought about obligation. Neighbors and communities learned that delay could cost lives, and that rapid, coordinated aid could make the difference between survival and death. The legacy went beyond technical reforms. Remembrance took physical form in memorials and museums near the sites where the ordeal played out. A state park, monuments, and interpretive displays were established to preserve both the artifacts and the narratives, to remind later generations of what can happen when hubris meets harsh nature. Writers and scholars returned repeatedly to the subject, examining decisions and testimony, seeking to understand not only the chronology of events, but also the motivations and failures that had converged on those snowbound encampments. Ethical debates continued, especially over the delicate realities of survival. These debates have never been merely academic. They shaped funerals, shaped legal claims, and shaped how survivors were received back into society. Beyond the immediate region, the story entered broader cultural memory as a cautionary tale. It became shorthand for the risks of improvisation in wilderness travel and for the weight of leadership when lives hang in the balance. At the same time, it brought forward quieter, human dimensions, acts of sacrifice that friends and strangers performed for one another, small kindnesses that made months of cold slightly more bearable, the tenacity of a child coaxed through hypothermia by a parent's lullaby. Those episodes, delicate and often private, offer another legacy, an insistence that history be read not only for its failures but also for the fragile courage that underpins endurance. Survivors who rebuilt their lives faced both sympathy and suspicion. Some found new homes and rebuilt families, others were marked by public curiosity or ostracized by neighbors who could not fully reconcile what had transpired. Legal disputes arose over estates and the disposition of property, as grief and confusion made tidy settlements impossible. At the same time, new institutions and processes emerged to mitigate future tragedies: better communication between settlements, more systematic aid organizations in frontier regions, and an increased public appetite for funding rescue when people were clearly imperiled. The story also changed how historians and ethical thinkers approached accounts of extremity. Writers who recorded testimony insisted on careful, respectful language. They resisted lurid detail and instead emphasized context, scarcity, weather, decision-making under duress. That approach altered popular portrayals over time, moving away from sensationalism toward a more sober reflection on human limits. Museums and memorials likewise chose interpretation strategies that honored suffering without exploitation, framing the events as a set of lessons rather than a spectacle. If one looks at the trail today, tracings of that winter remain in place names, in preserved cabins, and in the museums that invite quiet reflection. Those markers are both remembrance and instruction. They teach that travel across unforgiving landscapes demands humility, that communities can fail and can also mobilize, and that the memory of suffering, kept with dignity, can become a tool for preventing future loss. The long conversations about culpability and compassion continue, informed by survivor testimony, by archaeological evidence, and by the evolving standards of how we care for those in extremis. Thank you for listening to this careful account. If you would like more calm, historical narratives that respect the people at their center, please subscribe. Imagine a wind so cold it seems to push the world into silence. That is where our story ends, and where its meaning begins. Hello. Thank you for staying with me through this dark winter of American history. In brief, a chain of choices and misfortune pushed a band of emigrants into the Sierra. The ill-fated Hastings cut off and delays slowed their progress. Early snows trapped them at what became Donner and Reed camps. Facing hunger, exposure, and isolation, they endured terrible hardships until relief parties reached them and a few survived. The episode left a complex legacy of courage, failure, and the human cost of westward expansion. We have walked, briefly and respectfully, beside those who froze and those who labored to save them. We have named decisions that mattered, the lure of a shortcut, the failure to heed changing weather, the limits of preparation, and the small acts of mercy and stubbornness that also shaped what happened. Their suffering is not spectacle, it is a mirror. It asks us how we prepare, how we lead, and how we remember. If this account moved you, if you feel the weight of these winter mountains as first do, please consider subscribing. A quiet click supports careful research and keeps these stories from fading. In the coming episodes we will trace the routes that carried thousands to the west, examine the rescuers who risked their lives, and explore how this tragedy altered migration and public memory. History does not comfort us. It instructs us. The Donner Party's winter is a testament to the fragile line between hope and ruin, and to the endurance of those who bore both. As the light thins on this tale, take away these lessons, respect the land, question easy promises, and remember the human faces behind every headline of the past. Stay curious. Stay compassionate. Until our next story, keep watch over the paths we choose and the people who walk them.